Hello students, Dr. Devine here. This is the lecture on neoliberalism for Monday, March 30th on the syllabus. I had a hiccup with my video, but here we are. Sorry for the delay. I don't see a problem moving forward. I want to quickly remind you of some really important things and resources in case you haven't checked them out yet. So let's go ahead and look at my track site here, our track site. This is my screen. Let's go to 1310, our course. I want you to go to the online transition video and link to the YouTube video. I see that many of you have. Thank you for doing that. If you haven't, please watch that video. It's maybe 12 minutes long, and it will give you an overview of what you need to do to understand how we're moving online for the second half of the course. And then also just to flag once more the importance of the syllabus that can be found here, as well as the overview chart that has on one page the ways in which you're going to be learning in the rest of the course and how you're going to be evaluated. What's also really important for me to say before we jump in today's lecture is that I am here to support you. I understand this is a really difficult time, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you be successful in this course. So please take a deep breath, and I hope that your online learning can keep you on track and your mind motivated and thinking about other things besides this really challenging moment. So sending you all the warmest regards, and please reach out to myself or to our wonderful TA, Sarah Moya, if you need to communicate your situation and maybe some specific needs you have to help you complete this course successfully, okay? All right, so enough of the administration stuff. Let's jump into the lecture. This PowerPoint is now available for you on the track site. Okay, so you'll see here we have information about our office hours. And of course, the video that you have watched, the online transition video, has explained to you how to download Zoom, how to best use Zoom, and when we are going to have some real-time Zoom meetings. I want to remind you of what we were doing at the end of the first half when we were meeting in person. We were working on the section of the course called The Cold War and the Creation of the Third World. The Cold War is a chapter of globalization's history that I argue is, and many people argue, is fundamental to understanding the world today as we know it. So we have been thinking about the Cold War as another specific moment in the history of world geography that has produced political and economic relationships and histories that help us understand the world today. Okay, so we've been thinking about the Cold War, and one of the projects of the Cold War was the project of international development, which we're defining as the project of the poverty alleviation in the so-called third world by the first world. And it is indeed the post-World War II moment in which those categories, first world versus third world, are created. I'm going to be providing a lecture for you here online to summarize and hit the key points of that lecture from March 4th, the birth of development, creation of the third world. I'll also go back and revisit March 9th's lecture, Vietnam and Cold War, produce an abbreviated version of what we did in class together to help you get ready for the exam and to review the material and learn the material. And then we have the Northern Triangle as well. I will cover in that review lecture and finish a couple of points that we didn't get to finish in person that have to do with the violence in Central America's Northern Triangle and our understanding of its historical roots. So that's what we did before we went to the break. This is what we're doing this week. We're in week 10, and this is the lecture on neoliberalism, the Chilean experiment. So Monday's lecture March 30th, is focused on another chapter of globalization's history, what we're calling neoliberalism. Okay, so we're going to wrap our heads around neoliberalism today. For the second part this week, you are going to be reading a short article talking about structural adjustment policies, which are prerequisites that were attached to International Monetary Fund loans that were given to third world countries in the debt crisis of the 1980s. These conditionalities were neoliberal economic and political reforms, which opened up so-called third world economies to free trade and other neoliberal policies and ideas. So we're going to be learning about structural adjustment policies. They are the mechanisms by which, the way by which neoliberal reforms unfolded or were implemented in so-called third world countries. The really exciting part about this week is that I'm asking you to watch a documentary. Rather than doing a long reading, you're going to do a short reading and watch a documentary that's entitled Life and Debt. And I'm going to send you an email and provide you plenty of clear instructions online about how you're going to be able to stream that movie for free. And also a Word document that you can use as a viewing guide to answer questions about the film. You will not be submitting that viewing guide for credit. It's to enrich your learning experience as well as help you prepare for the exam. So speaking of the exam is going to be held, exam 2 will be April 8th, Wednesday, April 8th. And that's going to be conducted online, as I explained in the welcome back video. And I will also be communicating with you this week and the beginning of next week about how that's going to unfold. And one of the things that Sarah and I are putting together is a little test run for you on tracks under assessments, where all of your online assessments will take place, so that you will be familiar with how that system works before you take the exam. Okay, so that will happen on Monday as part of our review. And on Monday, April 6th, we're going to have a live Zoom review session from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. Copy and paste the URL, or even better, after downloading Zoom, enter the meeting ID, and that will allow you to participate in the exam review on Monday, the 6th. Okay, so that's sort of where we're headed in the near future and where we have been recently. Indeed, that's what we've just looked at is the material that will be covered on exam 2, which will have the same format as exam 1. And, you know, Sarah and I, just to say again, we're really taking into consideration you have a lot on your plate, and we're going to just help you get through this. Okay, so please just do the best you can and communicate with us and try to keep up with the material. All right. Okay, so what is neoliberalism? That's what we're getting at. You might have heard that term. I've certainly used that term in class. We're going to unpack the term neoliberalism in this lecture. Okay. And what I've provided here for you in my favorite graphic this semester, which has many of globalization's chapters here on this graph, on a temporal graph. What you have here is the location of neoliberalism in time. Okay, so neoliberalism is a period from the 1970s to 2008. It's a chapter of globalization's history that is characterized by the resurgence of economic ideas of free trade, comparative advantage, and global political and economic integration that occurred alongside technological achievements in telecommunication. Okay, so we want to remind ourselves of the idea of free trade that's epitomized by NAFTA. The idea, this is sort of classic liberal economic theory, hence the word liberalism is here. The idea that capitalist economies are best served when they reduce barriers to trade, when national economies integrate and specialize in the global economy, in the commodities or products that they're best at producing, and trade on the global market for other commodities. That's the idea of comparative advantage, that every nation should be specializing in the products that it's best in, rather than trying to produce everything for itself. Produce what it's best in, and then trade on the global economy to buy the things that it's not producing. The idea is that if everybody is doing what they're best at, productivity increases, all boats rise. That is the theory of economic liberalism, that indeed, as the term neoliberalism suggests, the new liberalism brings back these ideas about the benefits of free trade, comparative advantage, and global economic integration. Now, what's different about the current moment neoliberalism is the internet, telecommunication. That technology didn't exist during the period of what I'm calling in this class colonial liberalism. So the way in which information, money, and trade happens, the sort of time-space compression, that idea that it feels like places far away or closer because technology is speeding up our connections, that does distinguish this moment. In this lecture, we're going to be reviewing what we've already looked at in the last couple of weeks, was how this period of economic nationalism, of which the New Deal took place in the United States, this period of economic nationalism and the way that economists who were in power and influencing nation states like the United States, like Britain, the ideas that they had about running an economy were quite different than these ideas of neoliberalism that we have just reviewed. So we're going to be looking again at this period in which the Cold War takes place, as well as the Cold War sort of ends here, right, in 89 here. But we're focusing on this moment of the New Deal in the United States, of economic nationalism, where states thought, hey, after the Great Depression, the global economy can be turbulent, and states need to regulate the invisible hand of the market, right? That idea that markets should just run themselves, that hallmark of liberalism, that states shouldn't interfere, that the market knows best, the invisible hand knows best. States were really gun shy after the Great Depression. And remember, that's why in the United States, the New Deal was created, which is Medicare, Social Security, welfare programs, unemployment, housing programs, education bills to build the middle class, to help people get ahead in the market, right? This idea that states should play a large role in manipulating the economy to make sure that it serves society the best. Ultimately, liberal thinkers and neoliberal thinkers argue that you have to get the state out of the market, that state meddling in the market produces economic crisis. And that's exactly what happened in the 1970s. And one of the ideas that I'm working on in this course, and I want you to understand, is that when we look at the history of the global economy, we see these chapters of colonial liberalism, the period of economic nationalism, what we're going to define also as Keynesianism today. We'll get there. This is different than the moment of neoliberalism. And then we have this current moment that we're in, where people are actually questioning the benefit and the hallmarks, the tenets of neoliberalism, right? Promoting free trade, that NAFTA is good for America. These ideas are being challenged. And every time that we see a swing, a major shift in economic and political thinking, they're almost always enabled by crisis, and oftentimes global economic crisis. So we're looking again at this big picture of world geography, of global economic history, but narrowing in on this moment of neoliberalism today. So some key questions from the reading and this lecture that I want you to have under your belt are, what is neoliberalism? We've just defined it, right? What are some examples of neoliberal policies? Today, we're going to be focusing a lot on the United States and Great Britain, the so-called First World or Global North, and the latter part of this week we'll be focusing on how neoliberalism got to the so-called Third World and sort of what policies neoliberal ideas, the form that they took, which is, of course, structural adjustment policies. We're trying to get that idea under our belt this week. We're going to ask ourselves, why did the neoliberalism turn occur? How did it occur? I've already given you a clue that it might have something to do with, it has in part something to do with the economic recession of the 1970s. What happens in 1973 to tighten US-Saudi relations? And what impacts have neoliberal policies had on wealth redistribution in the United States? Okay, so we're looking at how neoliberal policies have redistributed wealth in the United States. And that's sort of setting us up for what we'll be doing later in this course. Okay, so first of all, let's get some other key ideas under our belt. These ideas that we're using in world geography draw on macroeconomics, on international political economy as a field of study. So let's talk about what is political economy, right? And what is economic liberalism? I'm using that term. I've used it today, I've used it in the past, but I want to give you a definition today. What is neoliberal economic theory? Okay, so let's look at some definitions, and some of these definitions I'm drawing from the book that the chapter that you read for this lecture, which was a really challenging chapter. There's a lot in there. I'd encourage you to go back and look at the chapter again after listening to this lecture. But what I want to make clear is that there is no one definition of these terms, but these are the definitions that I'm working with and that the text is working with. So the study of political economy is concerned with the interaction of political and economic processes within a society and the distribution of wealth and political power, okay? So imagine that you have a Venn diagram, right? Here's politics, here's economics. Where they overlap is political economy. And of course, political economists think that that overlap is really large. And some folks would argue that the economy and politics are inseparable. So we always have to study them in relationship to one another. I'm one of those proponents. That's why I don't study economic theory in a vacuum. I study how competing economic theories and policies have actually unfolded historically in the world. So that's political economy. Now, what about economic liberalism? Economic liberalism is the idea of organizing the economy along individual lines by supporting private property and free markets and free trade based on the idea of comparative advantage and laissez-faire policies. Laissez-faire means let it be, the invisible hand of the market. The market knows best, okay? Liberalism has connections with freedom here. In this case, freedom is connected with freedom of the market rather than other types of freedoms when we're talking about economic liberalism. What is neoliberal economic theory? Well, Harvey says, according that neoliberal economic theory is the assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by freedom of the market and of trade. So this is indeed the way in which neoliberalism as an idea brings together political liberalism and economic liberalism. The idea of individual freedoms are best guaranteed by freedom of the market. But really, basically, the most important definition that I have for you here is that neoliberal economic theory is the resurgence of 19th century ideas associated with laissez-faire economic liberalism and free market capitalism in the period of the 1970s to 2008, 2010. Okay, so you've got a couple of places, a couple of definitions for you there. They're all great. You just need to be able to explain these ideas. Okay, so another definition of neoliberalism that I think is really great. I found on Encyclopedia Britannica, and I've got the source for you here. So let's see if I can get to where I want to go. I want to encourage you as well to check out this page. So I'm going to take us there. This is a really great definition. It's a long definition, but it's a great definition of neoliberalism. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so neoliberalism is an ideology, a policy model that emphasizes the value of free market competition. Okay, there's a lot of debate, but it is most commonly associated with laissez-faire economics. In particular, neoliberalism is often characterized in terms of its belief of sustained economic growth as a means to achieve human progress. Its confidence in markets as the most efficient allocation of resources and emphasis on minimal state intervention in economic and social affairs, and its commitment to the freedom of trade and capital. Okay. So yes, this idea that the state should play a minimal role, not just in the economy, but also in providing social safety nets. So neoliberal policies have reduced the role of the state in providing welfare and social safety nets. So we often see big cuts to public spending under neoliberal programs. What's great about this definition here on Britannica is that it goes on to talk a little bit about how the period of in the 1970s, economic stagflation and increasing public debt. And a lot of that public debt was based on inefficient allocation of resources by the state or large state programs in the context of a shrinking economy. That stagflation and increasing public debt prompted some economists to return to classic liberalism, which in its revived form came to be known as neoliberalism. The intellectual foundations of that revival were primarily the work of Austrian-born British economist Friedrich von Hayek, who argued that interventionist measures aimed at the redistribution of wealth inevitably led to totalitarianism. And also Milton Friedman, who rejected government fiscal policy as a way of influencing the business cycle, called monetarism. Okay, so this is an interesting term. Monetarism is the government fiscal policy, is the economic ideology that advocates for governments using fiscal policy, manipulating interest rates, producing money, printing money, setting price controls, right? Interfering in the market, interfering in the value of commodities and money, right? That's what monetarism is. It was about the government using its ability to make money, to control interest rates, to manipulate, to pull the gears on the economy. And basically the neoliberals are saying that that large economic nationalism, that large state intervention into the economy that characterized the 1940s to the 1970s, the US and Britain around the world, created the inflation and stagnation of the 1970s, and thus economic liberalism must be revived to save the global economy from the glut of the 1970s. So I want you to read actually this entire thing on your own. I think that it is a great summary of a really big period of time. So please go ahead and finish that reading in your own time here. And I'm going to try to exit. Sorry, folks. Okay, so that was our introduction to neoliberalism. Now, what about neoliberal policies? We'll get there in a minute, but first let's talk about the neoliberal state. Okay. I'll put myself here by Margaret Thatcher. Okay. So the book that you read, David Harvey, he's a critic of neoliberalism. He thinks that it has been bad for the global economy. And he is really focused as a political economist on how these economic reforms were implemented through politics, through political means. So he's defining a neoliberal state as a state whose mission is to facilitate conditions for profit accumulation, wealth accumulation on the part of both domestic and foreign businesses, capital. The freedoms it embodies reflect the interests of private property owners, businesses, multinational corporations, and financial capital. So what Harvey is saying here is that there have been neoliberal states around the world, neoliberal governments around the world who have restructured their economies to favor not only domestic businesses, but international businesses over the well-being and freedoms and social guarantees of the citizens. Okay, so he's very much a proponent of economic nationalism in the sense that states should play a large role in making sure that businesses are paying their fair share. And what he's saying is that neoliberal reforms basically just opened up many economies to the interests of international businesses and finance. The globalization, the internationalization of finance and trade, of course, is a hallmark of liberalism. What really defines neoliberalism is the role of international finance. We'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about the 2008 crisis. Okay, so some examples of neoliberal states, places where governments have been mechanisms of neoliberal economic reform. Well, the book that you read talks about Chile under Augusto Pinochet. It also mentions that Margaret Thatcher created the neoliberal state in Great Britain, meaning that she created the government apparatus, the policies, implemented the ideas of neoliberal policy, neoliberal ideology in Great Britain. The United States, neoliberal reforms occurred under President Ronald Reagan and have been implemented under every administration since. Neoliberal policies were not a Democrat versus Republican, have not been a Democrat versus Republican issue. The Clinton administration implemented large numbers of neoliberal policies and free trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, trade agreements, free trade agreements in Southeast Asia. So Democrat and Republican administrations in the United States have been neoliberal states. And in the book also talks about how the Iraqi coalition after the second US-Iraq war in 2003, how Iraq post-2003 also had a coalition government that was a neoliberal state that pretty much opened up Iraq's natural resources to the highest international bidder and really created neoliberal economic conditions for wealth accumulation. And the picture up here, what we have, this is Milton Friedman, the economist at the University of Chicago, who was responsible for advising and implementing and popularizing neoliberal economic ideas in the United States, and also helped design or was influenced here with this idea of the Chilean experiment, that Chile was the first place in 1973 to undergo what would later be known as structural adjustment, neoliberal structural adjustment, a complete overhaul of the economy. So we have some key figures here, and then Margaret Thatcher, of course, the Prime Minister of England, elected in 1979, who implemented neoliberal reforms in Great Britain. Okay. So the Mont Pelerin Society was founded in 1947, and this is really the origins of the neoliberalism, the resurgence of neoliberalism. And what's interesting about the brief history of neoliberalism, is that it started as an idea, it's an economic ideology, right? And so I got this image off of internet, the sources are there for you, but this idea that ideas never die. Ideas are so powerful. Ideas can change the world. And indeed, neoliberalism is one of these ideas that, that did change the world. And it became common sense economic and political thought in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, up until the 2008 Great Recession. Then folks started rethinking global economic integration. But here we are, we're studying the origins of neoliberalism. And we certainly have to look at a cast of characters that I have pictures of for you here. We've got Friedrich von Hayek in the middle here, and this ideas never die. He was sort of the founder of the Mont Pelerin Society. Mont Pelerin is a spa or something in Switzerland. And it was a sort of think tank or a group of these scholars, economists that included Friedrich von Hayek, von Mises here, Ludwig von Mises. His name is not important. I do want you to remember Friedrich von Hayek. He was the Austrian economist who was one of the founders of the Mont Pelerin Society and the intellectual author of neoliberal economic ideology. So he worked with this guy, John Maynard Keynes. Oh, excuse me, John Maynard Keynes. No, sorry, here. This is Friedrich von Hayek, and here, this is Milton Friedman, okay, the economist at the Chicago School, the University of Chicago. So this was sort of the European influencer, but also, you know, global in his intellectual influence. This is Ludwig von Mises, also a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. And here we have Milton Friedman, who was one of the most influential neoliberal thinkers in the United States. And these three men were really the power of the Mont Pelerin Society. And they were very critical of the economic ideologies that dominated the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, what we've called economic nationalism. This economic ideology of economic nationalism in political economy terms is actually called Keynesianism. And it's called Keynesianism because it's named after this man here, John Maynard Keynes. He was a highly influential economist in the post-World War II period, and he had this monetarist, John Maynard Keynes, this economic nationalism. He really had this idea that the government should use its power to intervene in the market, to control the supply of money, to control the value of money, to intervene and manipulate interest rates, always to try to achieve full employment and the benefit of society, and to keep inflation reduced at all costs, right? It was sort of big government in the economy. The government spends a lot of money on social welfare programs. So this is called monetarist supply side economics. The supply is that the government is supplying the money, supplying the interest rates, supplying the levers, the pulls on the levers. And this is very different. This is not liberal economic theory and ideas at all, right? Keynesianism is the opposite of that period. I need to jump ahead here just a minute to this slide. So what we're talking about here, folks, is that what I have previously, for simplicity's sake, in our course called this period of New Deal economic nationalism. This is Keynesianism, protectionism, using quotas, tariffs, manipulating the value of currency and inflation rate. The state is playing a huge role in the market After the New Deal, people didn't trust the market. They thought states had to intervene. And Keynes was the economist who influenced these ideas. So this period of time is called Keynesian economics. The US and really sort of dominant economic ideology around the largely, first world countries was Keynesianism, okay? Monetarist, supply side. You don't have to remember monetarist supply side, but what I do want you to remember about Keynesianism is that the state was intervening in the market to achieve goals like close to zero or full unemployment, right? A full employment, zero unemployment, keeping inflation low, right? Adjusting prices, price controls to control the price of commodities. And really importantly, using tariffs and quotas that determine a certain number of goods that can come into the country and what goods can't come into the country to protect the national economy, okay? This is different than neoliberalism. Keynesianism is different than neoliberalism because this is a resurgence of the ideas of free trade, invisible hand, get the state out of the market. Okay, sorry folks if I'm just, going on too much about this, but I really want you to have this message clear. And I know that for those of you who are new to international political economy, which is what we're talking about, this is a lot of material. So thanks for letting me go over it a couple of times. So your chapter talks a little bit about the neoliberal reform, the experiment in Chile, which was the first place where a complete neoliberal overhaul of the economy happened. And this was made possible by the CIA-backed coup in Chile in the early 1970s, when the US backed Augusto Pinochet, who we talked about earlier, to have a coup in Chile to oust Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, democratically elected president in that country at the time. So once the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet was established, that power was used to implement a neoliberal overhaul of a once socialist economy in Chile to a new neoliberal economy in the Pinochet era. Now in the United States, neoliberalism comes with the leadership of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in 1980. Okay, that's when neoliberalism happens in these two countries. And this is called the Washington Consensus. Maybe it should be the Washington-London Consensus, but the Washington Consensus was this moment when Great Britain and the United States and also other leaders of first world wealthy economies came to the consensus that neoliberal economics was a better way of running their economies than Keynesian economics, right? So the Washington Consensus in 1980 flags the moment in which neoliberal economic policy becomes mainstream. I want you to now pause in the lecture. I'm going to stop recording, and we're going to go collectively to watch this clip together. I'm going to copy and paste it. I want you to do the same. Of course, you have your, there we go. Okay, so let me just do this. I want you to watch that clip. It's going to bring some of these actors to life. Oh, and I didn't get to do my animation. Let me do that because that was kind of fun. Okay. So the idea here is that the neoliberals really did not care for John Maynard Keynes' economic theory. So neoliberalism essentially was the death of Keynesian economics, which is that period of economic nationalism that I just described. Okay, so that was fun. I got to do that. All right, folks. So what we're going to do now is you're going to watch that video. I'm going to as well. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And that will be taking place in the part 2 lecture for today's material on neoliberalism.